We're going to be covering when to eat and also what to eat within 24-hour periods as well as over a year. Not just to maximize your wellness and how you feel and look, but how to maximize your overall longevity. I'm going to talk about some of my protocols as well that I've developed over the last 20 years being a researcher in this area and what works for me and what might work for you as well. Eat less often. Those 3 words, eat less often. That is the one thing that will have the biggest impact on your longevity based on all the science we'll talk about today.
Okay. And this doesn't mean eat fewer calories necessarily. It can, and that's good.
Yes.
That's good. But a lot of people struggle to do that, to eat fewer calories.
Well, it comes naturally. If you're down to 1 meal a day, which I am now, you shed weight and then you get your 20-year-old body back. That's a nice bonus. But then you maintain that weight. You have a larger dinner, which is what I do to make sure I'm not becoming malnourished. Clearly, we're not talking about malnutrition or starvation here. It's about packing your calories into a shorter period of time. It's not just about the period of eating. It's the period of not eating that's so important for boosting the body's defenses against aging to maximize longevity. And we'll talk about how that actually works in a minute. But you can still have a large body and fast and get the benefits. In my lab, we've looked at mice that are obese and tricked them into thinking that they're fasted, and they live just as long as a skinny mouse. So really it's about getting your body into this state of defense at any weight. Though I would say that there are certain optimal body weights that it's clear that if you're carrying excess weight, you're going to accelerate your aging clock. So not fat shaming anybody, but we're going through the science. This podcast is about what the science says, not what's socially acceptable. And it is true that if you're leaner, you will live longer. That is a fact. It's not necessary to get benefits by doing what we're going to say. But also, interestingly, as a side effect of eating less often, you will lose weight. I did. I've shed about 15 pounds since the beginning of the pandemic. And I look better, I feel better. And it's a nice side effect. But ultimately, what we're going to do here is we're going to say, these are the kind of things you should consider in your lifestyle. We're going to help you get there. We're going to ease you into it. There are some tricks that make it easier. And ultimately, you're going to end up with a lifestyle and hopefully a body that allows you to live decades longer. So I get questions every day from people, how should I fast? And my first answer is, well, you're an individual. You've got a different lifestyle, different tolerance for pain and hunger. You're a female or a male. You've got different microbiome. These are really important things to take into consideration. When we recommend things, what we're saying is you can try this. If it doesn't work for you, try something else. I'm not just guessing. I'm actually measuring it. So why do we do that for our bodies, which are even more important?
Yeah, bad habits.
Yeah.
That's what we do, right? That's what we've always done. I feel good. I don't feel good.
Yeah. Well, this is why I have autopilot. I drive a little crazy. I do that with my body as well. It's all an experiment. But let's go through the diets. Okay, so there's a fasting mimicking diet. Volta Longo, a colleague of mine from UCLA, is a proponent of that. That's a diet that lowers mTOR activity. It's low in these branched chain amino acids that I've mentioned.
Okay, and is that a diet that mimics fasting, or does that include periods of actually not taking in any calories?
It's both, but you don't have to be as rigorous about the period. The food itself will mimic it. So the
food itself is being processed by your body in such a way that the body is like, I could really use a little bit more. Or I could really like a little bit more. Like that.
You want the body to be in a state of perceived adversity. Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness, I'm running out of food. I'm not eating meat anymore because plants have less of these amino acids. So it responds to that low amino acid input. Volta's done some great work. Over the last few years, he and his group have shown that on this fasting mimicking diet, which they can send to your home, that actually helps cancer patients survive and get over chemotherapy quicker. Again, more evidence that fasting is good, not just for longevity, but for diseases. So that's one. The next one, let's talk about, which a lot of people call intermittent fasting. We'll just call it fasting. This is a period if you go longer than a day. Some people do 3 days. Some people go for a week. I wouldn't go longer than that because then you'll start chewing up your muscle, which you don't want to do. But these long extended periods are doing a real deep cleanse on the body and turning on that autophagy, that process of recycling proteins very deeply. especially once you get beyond the 3-day mark, when your metabolism switches into what's called chaperone-mediated autophagy, the deep cleanse. So that's fasting. And then there's time-restricted feeding, which is what I do, because I'm not very good at going beyond 24 hours.
Well, I think most people would really, really struggle to get there.
Yeah, time-restricted feeding, which is what I do, which is try not to eat till dinner. That's hard enough. My hat's off to people like Peter Attia, the doctor and podcaster who many of our audience will have heard of. He can go for a week, and he's got a lot of willpower. If you've ever met the guy, he's different than me. I'm more of a hedonist, but
Is he grumpier at the end of the week, do you think, than he is at the beginning of the week, though? I mean, like after all of that time?
He's always serious. That's what I can tell you, but brilliant. But let's get back to this time-restricted feeding. You want to have at least 16 hours of not eating or not eating very much. And then you can have 8 hours. So typically that means having a late lunch if you skip breakfast, or if you prefer to skip dinner, skip that. You can quit something, but you don't have to be draconian about it. I still like to steal a few scoops of ice cream if I see it, but I'm not going to eat a giant bowl of ice cream every night. That's a quick way to shorter lifespan.
We're not trying to ruin everybody's joy.
No, not at all. Christians fast. There's Ramadan for Muslims. These are not just coincidences. These aren't just religious practices. It's clear that humanity has figured out that you feel better, you look better, you ultimately are disease resistant. You might even help cure diseases by going through these periods of being hungry, or at least not having food in your tummy. Why? Because it activates these 3 longevity defenses that we just mentioned.
Now let's get into these really interesting, like sort of gold standard studies. There is one out of the Baylor College of Medicine. It was run by Isa Mendikoglu. This was published just last year, and it showed that fasting from dawn to sunset for 4 weeks improved blood pressure, reduced BMI, decreased waist circumference, and this is the important part, I mean, it's all important, but it upregulated DNA repair proteins. This is what we saw in all these model organisms as well.
Yeah, there are dozens of studies showing that periods of fasting is beneficial to people who are obese, not just because they lose weight, but they turn on their body's defenses. They become more insulin sensitive and their glucose levels come down. Also showing that people of regular weight, like me, can benefit from fasting. There's a number of studies there. And these are all in the show notes if somebody wants to go and check them out. But what's really interesting is that certain diseases, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, even cancer, those diseases seem to also benefit from fasting, including when you combine chemotherapy with fasting. You get this double benefit for many types of cancers. And then the final point that I think is really interesting is you can mimic fasting, say metformin. A number of doctors prescribe metformin to patients with prostate cancer because more studies are showing that these molecules that mimic fasting or combinations of both will help you beat cancer. What parent doesn't feel guilty when their kid feels hunger? But for long-term health, even programming the epigenome for long-term health requires some hunger in individuals. And what we do to kids is we say, big breakfast, here's a snack, here's a lunch, terrible lunch typically at schools, public schools, big dinner, go to bed full, wake up, eat some more. We're not just causing problems for these kids' physiology for the long run, 20, 30 years later, because their epigenome is now set for feast, not famine.
Right.
But we're also setting them up for obesity, which shuts off their survival programs right now. So their bodies are aging quicker than they otherwise would.
I wonder if that's not a really important sort of frame to put what we call the obesity epidemic into. Is it's not just an epidemic of making people bigger, it's an epidemic of making people age faster.
Absolutely. And we're going to see the impact of this in 2 or 3 decades from now with an increase of these diseases because the clock has been accelerated.
So this is, most of our listeners, most of the people who are listening to this, watching this, are going to be adults, are going to be making decisions for themselves. But much of this, if not all of this, is really translatable to what parents should be starting to help their children develop the habits of eating in these patterns as well.
Right. And
part of that
okay
is
to
getting
feel
used
hungry.
to being hungry once in a while.
Exactly. Yeah. and not just have food lying around that whenever they want a snack they can. That is the way that we evolved. We have this metabolic winter hypothesis that we've published. When we were, going back probably 100,000 years ago, back to 6 million, what was our lifestyle? We were cold and hungry. These days we live in air-conditioned and heated houses with food always available, which goes against what we've evolved to be optimal. And so we've got to go back to those days where occasionally we were hungry, occasionally we were cold. We'll get to cold therapy later. But basically the concept, if there's nothing else that you remember about this topic, just remember this, that we need to put our bodies in a state of want for them to fight diseases and have ultimate health in old age and give us longevity.
Vegetarian diets, plant-based diets here. We're gonna talk about a lot of those different choices in a minute here, but I do want to take us back for just a second to what's happening, like really what's actually happening inside our bodies when I sit down, and I still eat meat. I haven't followed you down this path yet. I love a steak. When I put a steak on my plate and I eat it, what's happening? What are those aminos doing?
Well, before you get aminos out of meat, you need to digest it. And so the first step is acid in your stomach is going to break down that meat into amino acids. And then your microbiomes can utilize a lot of them. And then those amino acids are also going to leach into your bloodstream. So now you've got these amino acids circling in your body, circulating. And there are 3 ones that are particularly important to know about. It's leucine, isoleucine, and valine, also known as the branched chain amino acids. And these are used by the body to sense protein intake. And the sensor is this protein complex we talked about called mTOR. Mm-hmm. And when there's lots of these 3 branched chain amino acids, particularly leucine, it'll be activated. And this mTOR, the role is to say, wow, we've got lots of amino acids, let's build muscle, let's repair cells, let's do all good stuff, which is why you feel good if you eat red meat and your microbiome can handle it.
Yeah, I feel great. I feel like I can fight a lion.
Yeah, you might have to fight a lion to get it. But what actually is going on that's deleterious is, in the long run, is that mTOR can do something even better for your longevity than build new muscle. It actually can turn on this recycling program called autophagy. And that it's very clear. There's no debate as to whether autophagy is good for you or bad for you. It's definitely good. So what I think people could do is to, if they want to eat meat, go for it. But try to focus on plant-based food more often so that there are periods during the week when there aren't as many leucine, isoleucine, valine molecules floating around in your body so that you have a chance for your mTOR downregulation to recycle proteins. Now, why do you want to recycle proteins? You might say, well, who cares about recycling proteins? Well, Alzheimer's disease is a good example of proteins that get modified and accumulate in your brain. And it happens not just in the brain, but in all tissues. We have these old proteins that linger, cause us to get old, to malfunction. But it's reversible. And it's reversible by fasting. It's reversible also by having low levels of these branched chain amino acids, at least part of the week.
Let's talk about these primarily plant-based diets. There is vegan diets out there. You said probably that's for many people, that's probably going to be the gold standard. But a lot of these plant-based diets have a little bit of meat in them. There's the Mediterranean diet. There's the Okinawan diet.
Lacto-ovo-vegetarianism.
Right, lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. Is there anything you want to say about these, or can we talk about them as sort of an umbrella group? Do we call them blue zone diets?
Well, let's talk about blue zones in a minute. I think what's interesting is that there was a really big study by the Adventist Health Group, 2013.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because what they calculated was the chance of dying based on various diets. And these were thousands of people. And what they found was that what's called the hazard ratio went down the more vegetarian and vegan you were. What does that mean? Your chance of dying goes down. And the number goes from 0 to 1. Whereas 1 is you're pretty likely to die tomorrow. Whereas a low number, which is around 80, means you've got 20% less chance of dying on any given day with this hazard ratio. So the numbers are the following. Non-vegetarians are at 1, if you call that 1. Compared to that, the next best one was semi-vegetarians at 0.92, and octo-ovo or lacto-ovo-vegetarians 0.91. Okay, so about almost a 10% reduction in mortality, death. And then you get into vegans, which 0.85, so that's 15% reduction in death. And then the best one was pesco vegetarian, so getting a little bit of meat.
A little bit of fish.
Yeah, a little bit of meat from fish. Probably the fish oils in there are beneficial. And then you're down to 0.81, so that's a 19% reduction in your chance of death at any given day late in life.
Okay, now that's all cause mortality, but we can also now see this in biologic aging because we now have clocks that we can use to measure our biological age. And there are studies now also that are showing that these diets are effectively reducing biological aging as well.
Right, and there are a couple of these. There's a 1-year study looking at a diet of mostly vegetarian. But the one that I think is really exciting is one that just came out a couple of months ago that looked at mostly women on a Mediterranean diet plus exercise over 2 years. And they could now calculate what happens to your biological age over those 2 years, having switched the diet. And they had various recommendations. It's very typical Mediterranean. Limit alcohol. If you have red wine, that's fine. A little bit of fish. Only use olive oil as your fat. And focus mostly on plants. That was their lifestyle. And then exercise was walking and some other weightlifting.
That's the Fiorito study?
Yeah.
Okay, so the interesting thing about this study, at least to me, the thing that jumped out at me is it came out of Giovanna Masala's lab at the Cancer Institute in Italy. And like you go like, well, why do people whose primary responsibility is to study cancer care about aging? And it comes back to this thing that you've been saying all along, which is that if we can reduce people's biological aging, we can cut diseases off where they actually start.
Well, that's exactly right. That these diseases that we think are just diseases are mostly caused by aging itself, and that slowing down that clock by fasting or eating the right foods, Mediterranean diet, is now shown not just to slow down the ticking of the clock, but probably reverses your age as well. And that's a mind-blowing concept. You have to think about that for a minute, that it's possible by changing your diet to reverse your biological age.